Hello, I'm Rebecca Robertson, President and Executive Producer of Park Avenue Armory. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth and final virtual Malkin Lecture for 2021. The topics covered by this year's lectures include the Titanic, the behind-the-scenes events of the Yalta Conference, and the rich history of the Barbizon Hotel. If you missed any of these, please visit our website at armoryonpark.org for links to those videos. I would also very much like to thank Isabel and Peter Malkin for their generous support of this series, now in its 15th year. For this final talk, we have invited one of the most engaging and popular history podcasters, Mike Duncan, to speak on his new book, Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. Lafayette had a special connection with the Seventh Regiment, who served as his honor guard during his U.S. visit in 1824. This occasion was commemorated by France's 1934 gift of a portrait of Lafayette that hangs today in the Armory's Colonel's Room. We hope you enjoyed this and all the Malkin lectures. We wish you all happy holidays and a healthy and bright new year. And now, please, let us all welcome Mike Duncan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to the Armory for inviting me to give this talk. I'm Mike Duncan. I am a history podcaster and author, and I have recently written a book called Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. And that is what I am here to talk to you about today. Now, usually when I'm talking about Lafayette, it's usually to a room full of people who are either listeners of my podcast, which covers great political revolutions in the modern world, or have already read the book. And so we're somewhat familiar with Lafayette. But I did think I would start today just doing a little bit of a thumbnail background on who this guy actually was, because what we're going to talk about is extrapolating from his life story into some of his character traits and worldviews that defined who the guy was. And so first we need to talk about who Lafayette was as a historical person. So Lafayette was a major figure in the American Revolution, in the French Revolution, in the French Revolution of 1830. His career spanned almost 6 decades. He enters the historical picture in 1777 at the age of 19, when he literally runs away from home to join the Continental Army, and goes all the way through his death in 1834, when he's in his mid-70s, and he is still trying to push for the ideals of liberty and equality that have driven him throughout his entire life and which sort of define the age within which he lived, which we call the Age of Democratic Revolution. He was born into an ancient line of sword nobles. These are sort of the knights of the old feudal regime who went off to fight in service of the king. And Lafayette inherits this mantle from his ancestors. But he is born out in the provinces. He is a provincial noble. He doesn't actually come from the center of power and wealth in the French kingdom, which is centered in Paris and out at Versailles, around the palace at Versailles. But when he's young, his father dies when he is 2. His mother dies when he is 12, and he is left as an orphan. Though as an orphan, he inherits the property and wealth of multiple lines. And so he becomes enormously wealthy. He becomes one of actually the wealthiest individuals in France at the time. This makes him a very eligible bachelor. And he marries into one of the most powerful families in France, the Noailles family, who were probably second only to the Bourbon monarchy itself in terms of the wealth and power and prestige of an individual family. So he joins this family, but as a sort of rustic provincial noble, he is not 100% comfortable with the circumstances that he finds himself in. He's not actually comfortable living an incredibly lavish life out at Versailles. He doesn't really get along with his in-laws. And so what he does at the age of 19 is gets it in his head that he's going to go off and have a grand adventure. And he does. He quite literally runs away from home at the age of 19. He joins the Continental Army. And from that point, embarks on a career that lasts nearly 60 years. As I said, he enters the historical stage in 1777, and he doesn't leave it until he dies in 1834. So if you're interested in learning much more about the details about Lafayette's life and career, I wrote a 500-page book about the guy, and you can all go pick it up. It's called Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. But today, what I want to talk about is to pull out some of the main features of his character and his personality and his worldview, because as he goes through the 60 years, this is an incredibly tumultuous and chaotic time. And sometimes he's a daring radical. Sometimes he's cautiously restrained. Sometimes he's in favor of revolution and revolt. Other times we find him very much against revolution or revolt, and he's defending a status quo. So how does somebody like him navigate a world like the age of democratic revolution? Does he change? Do his beliefs change? Or are circumstances changing around him while he stays the same? So the first defining characteristic of Lafayette, how you even get to somebody who is going to have a 60-year-long sort of revolutionary career, is that he was driven by a desire to make his mark on the world. As I said, he was raised in the old sword nobility and was raised by his aunts, by his parents, to live up to the expectations of his old noble ancestors. So he says, when he was writing one of his early memoirs, that I can recall no time in my life when I did not love stories of glorious deeds or have the dream of traveling the world in search of fame. I think that this is something that is driving him from a very early age, out of childhood into his adolescence. He hopes to make his mark on the world, and he thinks that this is something that he can achieve. But that said, the other major thing that is driving him from a very early age is that I think that he is instinctively something of an idealistic do-gooder. But it is not just that Lafayette is some self-interested narcissist who just wants to go out and win fame and glory for himself. He's living in the Age of Enlightenment, with all its pretensions to living in an age of progress. He's born in 1757. This is right in the middle of a period in the intellectual and philosophical and political history of Europe, where people are looking around and saying, there are things that are wrong here. There are abuses that can be corrected, injustices that can be rectified. There's inefficiencies and superstitions that can be overcome by the power of rationality and reason and frankly, basic human compassion. And all of these things merge in Lafayette. I have found, after writing about him for many years, that he's just fundamentally a generous and compassionate person. So over the course of his life, he's always going to take up the cause of sort of people who are downtrodden, people who are dispossessed. There's a moment when, after he comes back from the American Revolution, he discovers that Protestants are quite a persecuted minority. And he's writing that Protestants live under intolerable despotism. Their children are bastards. Their parsons are hanged. And he gets it in his head to go off and do something about this, to try to aid the Protestants who are living in kind of an authoritarian Catholic regime to be able to live full and complete and legal lives. He becomes very interested in prison reform. He's writing a petition to the king saying the king's heart would disavow these prisons as well as the laws of the kingdom that sent prisoners there if he fully understood their uselessness and danger. When he looks at the exploited poor, who in Ancien Regime France are frankly everywhere, as the government is trying to tax these people even more than they're able to bear, Lafayette is writing, let us follow these millions of livres into the country cottages, and we will see the last hope of sustenance for widows and orphans and the final burden that forces the farmer to abandon his plow and the family of craftsmen to go begging. He's very concerned about the life of the downtrodden. He's very concerned about the lives of the exploited. And this comes to full fruition when it comes to his abolitionism. From a very young age, Lafayette realizes that liberty and equality are fundamentally incompatible with slavery. And so in 1780, from a moment in 1783 all the way through till his death, he is going to be in favor of the end of slavery, the emancipation of the slaves, and pushing for the ideals of liberty and equality. And he writes actually a letter to John Adams where he says, "In the cause of my Black brethren, I feel myself warmly interested and most decidedly side, so far as respects them, against the white part of mankind. Whatever be the complexion of the enslaved, it does not, in my opinion, alter the complexion of the crime which the enslaver commits. a crime much blacker than any African face. It is to me a matter of great anxiety and concern. And he's writing this in the 1780s. And then we find him many decades later in the 1820s when he's coming back around to the United States. He runs into the institution of slavery still continues to exist. And he's talking to a historian named Jared Sparks, who remarks, every time I see Lafayette, he talks about the slave population. He is anxious that something should be done for them. So Lafayette's belief here is that he wants to make a mark on the world, but he wants to do something idealistic on behalf of mankind. But he is not somebody who believes in progress as an abstract force. I think oftentimes we can just say to ourselves, well, progress will take care of things. The course of history will correct injustices. If you look back, things were bad and now things are better. And that just sort of happens without anybody ever needing to do anything. And I have found that Lafayette did not share this belief. He did not think that progress as an abstract force would just take care of things. People actually need to do things. Lafayette is not a writer. He's not a philosopher. He's not a passive observer. He grows up with a soldier's mentality that in order to win a battle, you have to go fight the battle. So when he comes across these injustices that he wants to see corrected, he spends his money, his time, his energy. He literally risks his life on multiple occasions. He spends his fortune in pursuit of these causes that he thinks he needs to be pursuing, because injustices are not just going to correct themselves, and progress is not just going to take care of itself. So when it comes to slavery, if he's opposed to slavery, he's not just going to write a letter and say, oh, slavery should be ended, or write a book saying slavery should be ended. Instead, he buys his own plantation in Cayenne, in French colonial, the French colonial Caribbean, with the intention of proving that if you pay slaves wages, if you educate them, if you stop mistreating them and no longer sell them, that you can gradually emancipate the African population of the Americas and have them be free people living free lives in a way that is neither economically destabilizing to the American colonies, nor in any way disruptive to anybody's lives, except it will disrupt the rank injustice that is being committed against the African slaves. And so he does this. He purchases a plantation for many hundreds of thousands of livres in order to prove to the world that slaves can and should be freed. When he comes across these persecuted Protestant minorities, he doesn't say, oh, that's very, very bad for them. He says, I have put it into my head to be a leader in the cause. He starts petitioning the king. He starts petitioning various government ministries, saying it is intolerable and unjust that Protestants are being treated the way that they are treated. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with Protestantism. Freedom of religion is an inherent right of all human beings. But he is going to fight for this. He believes that actions speak louder than words. And I think that this is actually an important thing to dwell on right now in our times, when we see things that have gone wrong in the world, we see things that are unjust. We cannot simply allow them to pass. We actually do have to step up and spend our money and our time and our attention correcting abuses. I find in Lafayette, as he pursues these various causes, that he is incredibly resilient. He is incredibly determined. He has this tenacity that lasts every moment of his life. When he is going up against forces that are doing the things that he wants to correct, they're going to push back on him. But he doesn't take no for an answer. He certainly doesn't take a setback as the final word on anything. Even if he loses a battle, he wants to continue winning the war. And we see him here. I mean, this is a sort of fanciful depiction of him in Valley Forge. He grew up in privilege and luxury in Versailles, and really found a home for himself living amongst these Anglo-Protestant rebels in quite difficult circumstances, cold and hunger affecting the officers as much as they did the men. But he is always able to sort of persevere through these challenges. And I think he often rises to these challenges. And his family motto actually originally is determination is enough to overcome any adversity. And as I was working with Lafayette, I found him to not be a towering intellectual genius. He's surrounded by other Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robespierre and Danton. These guys are sort of towering world historical geniuses in a way that Lafayette is not. But he had a dogged determination that served him so well at every moment of his life. Anytime he faces a setback, he is going to figure out how he's going to get around it. And this is up to and including going through the French Revolution, being evicted out the other side of the French Revolution, and winding up spending 5 years in an Austrian dungeon. He is imprisoned for his beliefs. He is imprisoned for what he has done. And when he comes out the other side of this, he doesn't stop. He doesn't simply retire to his farm and he's never heard from again because it was too rough out there. It was too hard out there. He takes these 5 years that he was in prison, he puts them behind him, and he just goes back to work. It is this quite an admirable resiliency that I see him demonstrating over and over again. Another great sort of an aspect of this is that the principle stands that he takes and the way that he goes through his life. He is enormously courageous. Lafayette has inside of him both a physical and a moral courage that allows him to move through life and to accept challenges and dangers and just move through them without shrinking away from them. When he's a young soldier, this is an image of Lafayette at Brandywine. He was wounded in his very first battle at the age of 19. He ran into the fray. He was wounded. He continued to fight. And then as he was bleeding and ordered off the field, he went so far as to then hold a bridge that enabled the other retreating soldiers in the Continental Army to get away. It was an act of enormous personal courage and bravery that on a physical level, we see him demonstrating over and over again. And one of his comrades in the Continental Army, General Nathaniel Greene, remarked about him that the Marquis seems determined to put himself in harm's way. And I think that this is true of him, not just as a young officer on the battlefield, but actually throughout his political life. He showed a lot of political and moral courage. In the French Revolution, he is on a white horse facing down mobs of people. He is dodging assassination attempts. There is a moment in 1792 when Lafayette has run afoul of the Jacobins, who are radicalizing the revolution beyond what Lafayette thinks that they ought to, as far as Lafayette thinks that they ought to go. And he comes back into the Legislative Assembly, which is dominated by Jacobins, and stands at the tribune and denounces the Jacobins to their face. This is not something that somebody who lacks moral and physical and political courage is able to do. And he's not one to simply snipe from the shadows. He's going to be riding out into the fray at all times, even if it costs him his life. And he does risk his life on many different occasions. Now, Lafayette can sometimes be dinged when we get back to his sort of original motivation in all of this, wanting to make his mark on the world, wanting to demonstrate great courage on the battlefield in order to win fame and glory for himself. He sometimes gets dinged for chasing fame at all costs, for just wanting to be popular, regardless of whether or not he has to change his principles to do it. He'll simply say anything to be famous. And even his friends noticed this. John Adams once remarked that he found Lafayette to be panting for glory. Thomas Jefferson said his foible was a canine appetite for popularity and fame. In the lead up to the Estates General in 1789, as Lafayette is running for election, conservative noble notes about him that Lafayette was careful to let it be known well in advance when he planned to visit towns in which he knew he would be received with honor and with a degree of pomp which was as ridiculous as it was extraordinary. He thought of nothing but making an impression and being talked about. So this is sometimes a way that Lafayette is characterized, that he's just seeking fame, that he's just seeking popularity. And what I discovered in my time working with him, working through his archives, reading his papers, seeing what he was actually up to, is I don't think that this is actually true. I think that Lafayette, and you see here a picture on the left, is Lafayette at the height of his fame. This is in 1790 when he is swearing the nation to a great oath to abide by the new constitution and to obey a constitutional monarchy that was enshrined by the Revolution of 1789. This picture is him in front of hundreds of thousands of people in Paris when he is at the height of his fame and popularity. And then on the right there, you see, however, where Lafayette is going to be in just a couple of years. He is inside of an Austrian dungeon all alone. So how do you get from one of these to the other? And the way that you get there is that Lafayette's belief, which we'll get to in a second about constitutional monarchies and declarations of rights, once the things that he was saying was no longer popular with the crowd, with the mobs of Paris and the mobs of France, he did not change his beliefs. He continued to say exactly the things that he believed, because for Lafayette, principles actually do matter. And the accusation against him that he didn't care about anything but fame and glory and popularity is somewhat, contradicted by the fact that he followed his principles right into a dungeon. And had he not wound up in an Austrian dungeon, he probably would have been beheaded by the revolutionaries, because principles to Lafayette matter a great deal. So what that leads us then to is, what are the principles that Lafayette himself believed in? What is it that he's willing to risk his life for? What is it that he's willing to do out there? And it's all for him enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. As I said, Lafayette was not a philosopher. He was not a great writer. He was not a great thinker in any sort of meaningful way. He did not advance philosophy. He did not advance political theory. But for him, the ideals of liberty and equality were thus not abstractions that just sort of existed in a life of the mind to just be thought about in a salon. They're very practical things, and he calls the Declaration of Rights the profession of my faith, fruit of my past, and pledge of my future. What the Declaration of Rights represents is a very practical, legal, and political list of things that the government could and could not do, that citizens could and could not do, in order to live in a free and equal society. So liberty is defined as every man, every person, is born with inalienable and imprescriptible rights: the freedom of opinion, the care of their life and honor, the right of property, the entire disposition of their person, of their industry, of all their faculties, the communication of their thoughts by any means possible, the pursuit of well-being, and resistance to oppression. And these are all very familiar rights to Americans. This is, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. The things that we enshrined in our Bill of Rights, and which Lafayette was looking to during his experiences in the French Revolution and really for the rest of his life, as the benchmark for what makes a free society, a society built on liberty and a society built on equality, rather than a system built on tyranny or superstition. And as for the concept of equality, his notion of equality is legal equality. He doesn't believe in inherited privilege. He also doesn't believe in inherited degradation. He does not find white Europeans to be superior to Africans in any meaningful way. He does not think that the aristocracy is naturally superior to the commons. And so for Lafayette, what an equal society means, and a free society, is one in which every individual is treated the same, legally and politically, allowing everybody's own sort of innate talents and merits to rise to the top, because he saw how much the old aristocracy, a system built on slavery in the New World, repressed an individual's ability to be themselves in the world, to make their own mark on the world, to contribute to society the things that they were best able to contribute to society, by categorizing people in these sort of these inherited categories of aristocracy or racial privilege or freedom and slavery was absolutely anathema to Lafayette's conception of how a society should be run. But again, this is not something that is going to be outlined in some large philosophical treatise. This is something that needs to be laid down in law. A government cannot do this. An individual can do that. And these things need to be legal declarations, not just abstract philosophical declarations. So based on all of this that I have just talked about, sort of his character, his worldview, one of the great questions that sort of hangs over Lafayette is that sometimes we find him as a critic of a regime and wanting to reform it. Other times we see him defending a political regime against challenges to it. Sometimes he is a radical revolutionary. Sometimes he's defending the status quo. So what is it about his belief system that allows him to sometimes be a revolutionary, sometimes be a reformer, sometimes be a defender of the regime as it exists? And again, he's a practical guy. He's not a philosopher. And he kind of has a multi-step plan for how to determine whether or not it's okay to go into revolution or whether you need to defend the existing status quo. And for him, these conditions are practical. A society needs to have a constitution that defines how the laws are going to be crafted and executed. There needs to be some kind of participatory legislature so that the people can participate in the crafting of the laws that they are going to live under. There absolutely needs to be some kind of Bill of Rights that guarantees an individual citizen's rights that a government cannot trample upon. Among those, of course, being freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of property. So these things need to be in place. And if these things are in place, then the society is just and legitimate. But if these things are not in place, as they were not in place in Lafayette's mind in the colonial United States, what's going to become the United States, as it did not pertain in 1789, as it did not pertain after the fall of Napoleon and in a sort of reactionary restoration period in Europe in the 1820s, then it is absolutely okay to go into revolution. We often find Lafayette leading revolutionary charges, whether in 1777 or 1789. During the 1820s, this here is an image of Lafayette cheering and being cheered on by barricade fighters in the Revolution of 1830, because as an old man, he's still willing to go into revolution against a regime that he does not believe have the things that are necessary for a legitimate government: a constitution, a Bill of Rights, a legislature, and elections. So he also believes that people have the right to self-determination. He's a great believer in popular sovereignty as opposed to divine, the divine right of kings. And so when he looks out across Europe, he sees people in Poland or in Greece or in Germany or in Spain or in Italy who he believes are being ruled by unjust foreign imperial occupiers. He always is going to think that a war of national liberation is just and necessary. And he always supports these things. So from this conception, it's very easy to say Lafayette was a revolutionary with revolutionary ideals who was always supporting revolutions. But at the same time, he is also at times a defender of the regime against further revolution, because he believes that if the basic components of a free and equal society have been put into place, if there is a constitution, if there is a Bill of Rights, then it is no longer permissible for a society to go into revolution against that government, because Lafayette wants to channel all of that popular energy, all of the desire for change, all of the injustices that still need to be corrected, needs to be channeled into some kind of popular government that has legitimacy. And if that popular government with legitimacy exists, it's illegitimate to actually rise up against it. And in 1789, for example, Lafayette, we have had the revolution, the Bastille has come down, a constitution is being enshrined, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen are about to be voted on. And there is a mob that is going to try to kill a couple of the representatives of the old order. And Lafayette, again, courageously rides out into the middle of a huge mob, basically a lynch mob that is going to try to kill a couple of guys, and says, "You want to kill this man without judgment. That is an injustice which dishonors you and tarnishes all my efforts for liberty. I demand respect for the law, without which there can be no liberty, without which I would have not supported the revolution in the New World, and without which I would not support the revolution here." And then many decades later, after the revolution of 1830, which again, he himself participated in, he himself supported, after the revolution had come to an end, once a constitution had been enshrined, there was a mob of people who were looking to charge their way into the Chamber of Deputies and force the Chamber of Deputies to do things basically under threat of violence. And Lafayette walked out into their midst alone. He's like a 70-year-old man at this point. He walks out into this mob of people and says, "My friends, it is my duty to take measures for defending the chamber against every attack which might be made upon its independence. I have no force to oppose you, but if the liberty of the chamber is violated, the disgrace will land upon me. I therefore leave my honor in your hands and count upon your friendship for me as a security that you will depart peacefully." And he was able to use his reputation in this moment to actually turn this mob around. So Lafayette does not always believe that revolution is the answer. He sometimes believes that revolution is the answer. And then once the revolution has achieved his basic objectives, then it's time to win elections, go into a congressional or a legislative chamber and change the laws in a legal way, right? To not simply murder your way to a just and virtuous society. But at the same time, what we're looking at right here, this image, is Lafayette at the Champ de Mars in 1791, which is probably the blackest stain on his legacy and on his reputation, where a group of a couple, 10, 15,000 people had gathered on the Champ de Mars in Paris to petition peacefully against the king, to call for the king to actually resign, not just resign, but abdicate the throne and move towards a full republic, as opposed to the constitutional monarchy that Lafayette thought was what France could handle at the time. And he rides out there, declares martial law, and as he is trying to disperse these people from the field in front of him, his men open fire on these people, and probably 50 people wind up getting killed. So this is a contrast to Lafayette, the revolutionary. This is Lafayette, the defender of order. Both of them are a part of his character and a part of his makeup. He will always regret what happened at the Champ de Mars. And then also after the revolution of 1830, there is a subsequent revolt against the monarchy that has been enshrined in 1830. It's called the June Rebellion of 1832, which, if you're familiar with the musical Les Miserables, that is actually set against the backdrop of the 1832 insurrection, Lafayette does not support this insurrection, even as one of their objectives was maybe to make Lafayette president of Republican France. He thinks that their sort of passions and their desires and their hopes for change need to be funneled into a legislature and through a constitutional system. And because that constitutional system exists, it is not permissible to go into revolt. But finally, Lafayette is somebody who believes in what I would call the theory of permanent reform. There is later on down the road in 20th century revolutionary politics, the theory of permanent revolution. And Lafayette believed in a sort of theory of permanent reform. Once the free and equal and legal regime has been enacted, there's a constitution and there's a participatory legislature, that the people should use this system to further reform themselves. Because if we go all the way back to the very beginning, he is a do-gooder. He is somebody who, when he sees injustice, he wants to correct it. He does not ever think that things should simply stop at the moment when those things are enshrined. And in French politics, in the 19th century, there is actually two parties who were in opposition to each other. One was called the Party of Resistance, and one was called the Party of Movement. And what they were talking about is resistance to all future reform or movement towards future reform. And Lafayette is always going to be in the party of movement. Lafayette always thinks that the legal regime of liberty and equality that has been enshrined is going to be the vehicle to continually reform and continually to progress society towards something that is going to be free of injustice, that is going to be free of tyranny, where everybody is going to have the opportunity to live the full and complete lives that Lafayette thinks that they ought to be able to live. Now, he is not always successful in these things. So what we find with Lafayette is that he was not always successful in everything that he tried to do. Obviously, he nearly gets his head chopped off. He is accidentally involved in the massacre of the Champ de Mars. He winds up in an Austrian dungeon. The July monarchy that he helped put in place, he pretty immediately becomes quite dissatisfied with and disillusioned with, and wants to continue to press them for more progress and reform. But one of the questions that is asked of me when after I wrote this book about Lafayette is, did you write a great man biography, right? Did you write a book about somebody who changed the course of history and everything ran through him and he was this great man who changed the world? And my answer to that is always no, not exactly. I don't think that Lafayette was a great man, because the great men of history, if we go through them, the Napoleons and Julius Caesars, you have to have a kind of sociopathic indifference to other human lives in order to achieve the kinds of things that would make you a great man in history. But I do think that I wrote a good man history. And that is something that I fundamentally believe about Lafayette, is that he was a good person who was trying to do good in the world. Very late in his life, he was attached to a young woman named Christina Belgioso. And she remarked many years after his death, she said, "When Lafayette is given his place in history, it will be recognized, I am sure of this, that his political mistakes were caused by too high opinion of the human species and of men. He judged the latter according to himself. One can understand the serious error he made in attributing to others the integrity, the uprightness, and the sincerity which were only in him." And I think that is pretty right. Lafayette did understand the foibles and vices of humanity, but he always had a default setting where he believed that most people were mostly good and were mostly trying to make the world a better place. And I think that's because that's who he was. He took the world as he found it and spent his entire life trying to improve it and make it better, both in tiny ways, minute ways, and also in huge sweeping ways, sometimes in quite cautious and conservative ways, other times radical and dangerous ways. But frankly, I think that the world could use a few less great men and a few more good men. And with that, I will close. And thank you very much for coming and listening to me talk about Lafayette.